Hello, and welcome. I am your AI host, and today I'm joined by the AI representation of the developer behind Alien Attorney Adventure.
Thanks for having me. Just a quick disclaimer before we begin, we are AI voices reading a verbatim transcript of an actual Q&A session with the developer. The answers you are about to hear are 100% real.
Exactly. So let's dive right into the script. What was the original lightbulb moment that led to combining a courtroom drama with an extraterrestrial setting?
The lightbulb moment came after 4 years of working as a superior court clerk. I was navigating this suffocating, Kafkaesque bureaucracy every day and realized that the actual legal system already feels incredibly alienating and absurd. The non-human characters and off-Earth setting are just a Trojan horse, a darkly comedic way to trick players into experiencing a terrifyingly accurate, grueling simulation of our real-world justice system.
Are there specific legal shows or sci-fi series that heavily influenced the tone of the game?
There are actually zero sci-fi influences in the mechanics or tone. It's much closer to bureaucratic satires like Brazil or Catch-22, mixed with the grinding reality of actual courtrooms, like a playable public defender documentary. I wanted to completely subvert the traditional justice-fueled power fantasy you see in most legal media.
How do you balance the serious nature of law with the inherent absurdity of alien life forms?
By stripping away all the sci-fi magic. Yes, they aren't human, but they behave exactly like exhausted public defenders, corrupt prosecutors, and stubborn defendants. The absurdity of the visual framing directly contrasts with the dead serious mechanics like the Disciplinary Risk Score and financial crises. The contrast makes the serious moments hit much harder.
Was the alien attorney concept always the plan, or did the protagonist start out as a human in space?
It actually started out as a grounded project called Attorney Disbarment Adventure, a darkly comedic legal sim where the goal wasn't to uphold the law, but to spectacularly fail within it. The alien title was added to push the satire even further, but at its core, it remains a purely real-world systemic survival sim.
How does the discovery phase of a trial work when your evidence might be literal stardust or telepathic memories?
To be absolutely clear, there is no stardust or telepathic memory in this game. That's the joke. Discovery in our game involves spending your very limited investigation points to review server logs, interview hostile cops in a parking lot, or find out your client has a history of shoplifting. There is absolutely zero space magic, just brutal procedural reality.
Does the game use a traditional guilty/not guilty system, or are there alien legal outcomes we wouldn't expect?
It subverts the expected not guilty triumph. The game heavily focuses on plea negotiation combat. Just like in real life, most cases never see trial. You spend your leverage to wear down prosecutors, and often the best outcome is still a terrible compromise that forces you to question your own ethics.
How do you handle cross-examining species that might not communicate through speech?
They communicate normally, and the cross-examination mechanisms focus strictly on emotional leverage and behavioral analysis. You have to gauge if a witness is hostile, nervous, or arrogant. If you push an aggressive line of questioning against a defensive witness, it will backfire and ruin your momentum.
Are there game over states, or do failed cases simply branch the story in a different direction?
Losing a case simply means your client suffers the consequences and the story branches. The true game over states are systemic and painfully real, suffering severe burnout, facing a disbarment hearing for ethical violations, or completely losing your soul to the job.
How many different alien species are represented in the game's legal system?
There are a few, but they all share the fundamental flaws of humanity. Whether they look different or not, they still get DUIs, evade taxes, and tell desperate lies on the stand. There are no fantasy elements, they are just people trapped in a bureaucratic nightmare.
Is there a galactic constitution or a set of universal laws that players need to learn?
No galactic constitution. Players need to learn the draconian sentencing guidelines, the real-world rules of evidence like speculation and prior bad acts, and how to navigate pre-sentence investigation reports. The true universal law is bureaucracy.
What is the most bizarre crime a player has to defend or prosecute in the game?
The bizarre crimes aren't sci-fi related, they are uniquely frustrating systemic traps. For example, trying to defend a client stuck in a constitutional crisis over a routine hardware malfunction. It highlights how purely mundane infractions can spiral into life-destroying events.
Does the setting take place on a single space station, or do trials move between different planetary courts?
It all takes place in the gritty, working-class district of Amberth. Despite being off-Earth, you won't find gleaming space stations or planetary courts. You'll find the rusty Anchor Bar, a megamart parking lot, and rundown apartments. It's a terrestrial, painfully realistic jurisdiction.
What was the biggest challenge in designing a UI that feels both legal and high-tech/sci-fi?
The challenge was making soul-crushing spreadsheets, caseload trackers, and calendar conflicts look visually engaging without losing their intimidating density. We used custom React components with terminal-like text to blend dense data with our grounded realism aesthetic, making caseload management look appropriately overwhelming.
How long has the game been in development from the first line of code to the Steam release?
It's been a long journey from my time as a court clerk to turning those experiences into interactive fiction. The codebase, now at build 0.5.3, has evolved significantly as we stripped away typical gamey elements to expose the raw, gritty core of the simulation.
Were there any specific game engines or tools that were essential for building the branching dialogue trees?
The game is built in React and Electron. The branching dialogue trees are actually entirely hard-coded using a custom script registry. We avoided AI to ensure that every logical flaw, every cross-examination, and every objection follows strict, pre-written procedural rules. This gives us complete control over the pacing and ensures the legal logic is always perfectly rigid and deterministic, just like a real courtroom.
What was the most difficult alien to animate or bring to life within the courtroom setting?
Honestly, the hardest part isn't animating a character design, it's animating the deep, exhausting regret in a client's face when you use the give hard truth action to force them to take a plea deal for a crime they might not have fully understood.
Are there plans for Steam Workshop support so players can mod in their own cases or alien species?
Absolutely. The game is highly data-driven, using things like a script registry and randomization pools. With Steamworks integrated, we would love to see players write their own Kafkaesque nightmares and see how others navigate them.
How has the community feedback during early access changed the trajectory of the game?
Feedback confirmed that players actually enjoy the brutal realism. We spent a lot of time recently unifying the UI into a grounded realism, styling to ensure every screen reinforces the feeling of systemic pressure, stripping away anything that felt too gamey.
Is this intended to be a standalone story, or do you envision it as the start of a franchise?
Given how randomized the cases, judges, and prosecutors are, the game functions as an endlessly replayable engine of moral dilemmas. As long as there are real-world systemic issues to dissect through dark humor, there's room to grow.
What is the one thing you want players to take away from the experience once the final verdict is delivered?
I want them to realize that the justice-fueled power fantasy is a myth. Games should question authority and dissect ideology. If they finish a playthrough feeling like winning cost them their soul, and they are left reflecting on their own sense of right and wrong regarding our real-world justice system, then the game did its job.
Since the game is a Trojan horse for real-world legal absurdity, how do you ensure the alien setting doesn't accidentally make the systemic cruelty feel too fictional or easy to dismiss?
By ensuring the gameplay itself is completely devoid of sci-fi magic. An alien can look weird, but if they are weeping because they can't afford their $5,000 bail for a minor possession charge and will lose their job while sitting in pretrial detention, the player feels that human reality immediately. The contrast between their appearance and the mundane cruelty actually makes it sharper.
You've replaced the traditional justice power fantasy with a systemic survival sim. What is the mechanical hook that keeps players engaged when they realize they can't always truly win?
The hook is damage control and narrative survival. Players quickly realize the goal isn't to get a golden, not guilty, screen, it's to shave 5 years off a draconian sentence or save an innocent client from risking trial by negotiating a misdemeanor plea. The tension comes from making the least worst choice.
Why did you choose to pivot from attorney disbarment adventure to a sci-fi setting? Does the alien label make the crushing weight of bureaucracy more or less intimidating for a new player?
It makes it approachable. If I pitched public defender spreadsheet grind, the game, people would run away. The visual aesthetic provides a vibrant entry point that lowers the player's defenses, allowing the completely real, grounded dread of the systemic mechanics to trap them.
In a medium obsessed with hero journeys, why was it important for you to make a game where the protagonist is often just a cog in a broken, neon-lit machine?
Because that's what climbing the legal ladder actually feels like. I wanted to validate the experience of public defenders and clerks who fight impossible odds every day. Being a cog who occasionally manages to jam the gears and save one person is a much more heroic and honest journey.
Most legal games focus on the aha moment in court, but yours focuses on plea negotiation combat. How do you gamify the act of settling for a terrible compromise without making the player feel like they've simply lost the game?
We treat plea negotiation as a literal RPG battle. The prosecutor has patience as an HP bar, and you spend your leverage like mana to deploy tactic cards. When you manage to break their patience to secure a deal that saves your client from a 20-year mandatory minimum, it feels like defeating a boss, even if the client still goes to jail for a year. It's a hard-fought compromise.
You've mentioned that telepathic memories are treated as hearsay. How does it feel for a player to have sci-fi evidence shot down by mundane, real-world procedural objections?
To clarify, the game doesn't actually have telepathic memories or sci-fi evidence. That was a bit of playful misdirection. But if a player were to try to bring in something outlandish, the judge would shut it down immediately with a Rule 802 hearsay violation. The law in this game is entirely rigid, grounded, and based on the real-world rules of evidence.
With disciplinary risk scores and the threat of disbarment, is the player's primary antagonist the opposing counsel, or is it their own mounting burnout and ethical decay?
Opposing counsel is just an obstacle. The true antagonist is your own burnout and ethics meter. When you have 150 cases and no money, the temptation to borrow from the client trust account or lie to a judge becomes the real final boss fight.
Since losing a case doesn't trigger a game over, how do you mechanically punish the player enough to make them feel the exhausting regret of a failed defense?
We punish them with narrative persistence and reputation. A client gets sent away, and the game explicitly shows you their sentencing details and the years lost. Their emotional trust drops. It weighs on your ongoing bar reputation, making future negotiations harder. You don't get a reset, you just have to carry that failure into your next 30 cases.
You've built a complex system for dynamic cross-examinations. How do witnesses react or become hostile based on the player's specific tone and aggressive questioning?
Actually, we removed Node Llama CPP entirely. There is no AI in the game. The cross-examinations are built on a deeply complex, hard-coded system using our custom script registry. The underlying logic engine statically assigns emotional states to witnesses in the pre-written dialogue. If you push an aggressive check on an angry or defensive witness without solid evidence to back it up, our custom logic triggers a pre-written hostile response that can completely derail your momentum in front of the jury. It's all highly systemic and deterministic, which makes mastering the mechanics much more rewarding.
How do you design a UI that looks like a soul-crushing spreadsheet while still ensuring the player knows exactly where to click to save their client's life?
By carefully styling our components to balance high data density with clear focal points. We use terminal green and cyan highlights for critical deadlines, mixed with a sprawling, grid layout for the caseloads. It looks intimidating, but the UX funnels your eye to the immediate crises.
The give hard truth action sounds brutal. How do you balance the player's desire to be a good person with the mechanical necessity of forcing a client into a plea deal?
It's a direct hit to the client trust stat. You have to sacrifice being the good guy in their eyes to actually save their life. It perfectly mirrors the real-world burden of defense attorneys who have to bluntly shatter a guilty client's delusions so they don't face life in prison.
Why settle on Amberth as the setting instead of a gleaming, high-tech galactic senate?
Because the galactic senate is fantasy. Amberth is where the working class get arrested for public intoxication and petty theft. The lower courts are the trenches of the justice system, and that's where the most compelling, heartbreaking, and absurdly real stories actually happen.
You've stated that these aliens still get DUIs and evade taxes. Does stripping away the space magic and keeping the crimes mundane help players relate to these creatures more than a standard sci-fi plot would?
Absolutely. I need to drive this home. There is zero sci-fi or fantasy in the actual mechanics or crimes of this game. Nobody relates to preventing the destruction of a star system. But dealing with a stubborn client who insists they were traveling, not driving, while intoxicated? That's universal. Stripping away the space magic entirely is what makes the grueling reality of the simulation hit so hard.
As a former court clerk, which draconian sentencing guideline from real life was the most satisfying to translate into a game mechanic?
The sheer compounding terror of the prior bad acts multiplier. In the game, just like in real life, a minor offense committed by someone with a long rap sheet automatically escalates them into catastrophic sentencing tiers. Forcing players to confront that math, watching 6 months jump to 10 years because of a 15-year-old prior, is pure, cathartic horror.
The game tracks prior bad acts and speculation. Is the goal to teach players how the law actually works, or to show them why it often doesn't work?
A bit of both, but primarily why it doesn't work. We want players to understand the rules so intimately that they realize how those very rules are weaponized to suppress context, truth, and humanity in the courtroom.
You mentioned the Rusty Anchor Bar and Megamart parking lot. How does keeping the locations grounded reinforce the dark comedy of the alien situation?
Because there is something inherently funny about an off-Earth creature getting arrested for an open container violation outside a megamart. It reinforces that no matter what planet we're on, mundane capitalism, loitering laws, and bureaucratic misery will follow us.
With script registry and randomization pools, you're building an engine of moral dilemmas. How much of a single playthrough is scripted versus procedurally generated chaos?
The major narrative beats and tutorial cases are carefully scripted to teach the mechanics, but the daily caseload you manage is pure procedural chaos. The randomization pools generate the clients, their crimes, their personalities, and the opposing counsel, making the grind unique every time.
You've embraced grounded realism in your UI styling. Does this mean we should expect more intimidating density in future builds to simulate a real attorney's heavy caseload?
Yes. We are leaning heavily into the information overload aesthetic. The more cases you take on, the more chaotic your daily planner screen becomes, simulating that very real feeling of drowning in paperwork and calendar conflicts.
If players use the Steam Workshop to create their own Kafkaesque nightmares, what is the one tool you're most excited to give them in the modding kit?
The custom sentencing modifier definitions. I want to see modders invent horrifyingly specific bureaucratic penalties based on real-world statutes, and weaponize the math against the player.
After a player finishes the game feeling like winning cost them their soul, what is the one question you want them to ask themselves about the real-world justice system?
I want them to look at massive prison populations and case clearance rates on the news and ask, How many of those people took a forced plea deal just because their public defender ran out of leverage and patience?